So usually when you picture the future of technology, you probably imagine something incredibly sterile.
Right, like perfectly climate-controlled rooms.
Exactly. Massive humming server farms bathed in this cool blue light, just silently crunching data. It feels entirely detached from the natural world.
Well, it feels like it exists in a vacuum.
Mhm.
But the moment you zoom out and look at the physical environment surrounding that data center, I mean, that pristine image just shatters entirely.
Yeah, because we are looking at a global physical landscape right now that is volatile, chaotic, and frankly, highly destructive.
It really is.
Which brings us to the core of what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, we are looking at a massive collision course.
A really unprecedented one.
Right. On one hand, you have the greatest influx of investment in human history pouring into artificial intelligence and global energy infrastructure. We're talking trillions of dollars trying to build this perfectly predictable digital future.
But then on the other hand, you have the harsh, totally unpredictable physical limits of our planet pushing back.
Exactly. So to get into this, we're pulling from a fascinating stack of sources. We've got a technical bulletin from the Bank for International Settlements on AI economics, plus a Greek geopolitical analysis of the latest IEA energy report.
And we're pairing those with real-time news dispatches from the devastating wildfires currently burning across Greece.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you really want to understand where global infrastructure is heading over the next decade, we kind of have to start with the digital side, right?
You do, because the scale of the AI investment boom happening right this second, it is fundamentally rewiring the global economy.
It's just a literal tsunami of money. Like looking at the numbers from the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, it instantly reminds me of the 19th century railroad boom.
Oh, that's a really good comparison.
Right, because back in the 1800s, investors laid millions of miles of steel tracks across continents before they even knew what goods they were going to transport. They just knew they needed the rails, and they figured, well, the freight will follow.
Yeah, build it and they will come.
Exactly. And today, tech companies are doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But instead of steel tracks, they are building server racks, specialized chip factories, massive cooling systems, and they're just hoping that AI software profits will eventually justify the cost.
And what's fascinating here is the physical footprint of that build-out.
Hmm?
It's staggering. According to the BIS, capital spending on data centers, semiconductors, and just all the supporting infrastructure is already hitting 1% of the entire gross domestic product in heavily exposed economies.
Wait, 1%?
Yeah, 1% of GDP in places like the US and Australia.
Just pause on that for a second.
Hmm.
1% of an entire nation's economic output is being poured into AI plumbing.
And it's accelerating. Industry projections expect global AI-related investment to skyrocket from about $500 billion today to between $3 and $4 trillion by 2030.
That is just hard to wrap your head around.
I mean, they're anticipating capital expenditures on data centers alone to basically triple in just the next few years.
Hold on, though, because this is the question that screams out when you look at these figures. Where is all this cash actually coming from?
Right, that's the big question.
Because the data shows these AI companies are heavily draining their free cash flows to build these centers. If they are spending way more than they make, aren't we just inflating a massive debt bubble? What happens if the productivity payoff just doesn't arrive on time?
Well, the mechanism behind how they are funding this shortfall is what is truly alarming. They aren't going to traditional banks. They are turning to private credit.
Oh, wow. Okay.
To give you some context, traditional banks often have strict regulatory limits on how much risk they can take on these speculative cash-burning projects. So AI firms are bypassing them entirely and going to private credit markets, which are much less regulated.
And highly aggressive, I imagine.
Very. In 2016, private credit loans to AI-related firms were basically at zero.
Nothing.
Nothing. But by 2025, that number had verticalized to $200 billion.
$200 billion. That is a staggering amount of unregulated leverage.
And the bond markets are just equally euphoric. AI firms issued $243 billion in bonds in 2025 alone. That's a massive leap from just $79 billion 2 years prior.
Wow.
And this explosion of debt is creating a massive wealth effect in the stock market. By 2025, the weight of AI firms in the U.S. equity market capitalization had jumped to a staggering 40%.
Okay, let's make that tangible for you listening. That means 40 cents of every single dollar invested in the U.S. stock market is essentially holding its breath, waiting for these AI companies to actually deliver on their promises of this new technological utopia.
Exactly. And the ripple effects of this aren't just contained to Wall Street either. It is aggressively restructuring global trade.
Because the AI supply chain is deeply physical, it's not just software.
Right, it requires specific hardware, rare earth metals, incredibly complex semiconductors. So the countries that manufacture and export these upstream physical goods, places like South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, they're experiencing historic windfalls.
Right, the technical term the BIS uses is terms of trade gains. But wait, let's back up. Terms of trade gains. In plain English, that just means the stuff these countries are selling to the world has become vastly more expensive than the stuff they are buying from the world, right?
That is the perfect translation, yeah. The global desperation for AI chips means these manufacturing nations can essentially name their price. But it creates a profound structural vulnerability.
How so?
Well, take South Korea, for instance. Just 5 firms accounted for 43% of the entire country's export earnings in the first quarter of 2026.
Wait, 5 companies controlling nearly half of a nation's export economy?
Yes. So if the demand for AI hardware dips, say if that $200 billion private credit bubble we just talked about bursts, half of South Korea's export economy takes a direct catastrophic hit.
Which introduces the ultimate macroeconomic headache. The BIS warns that central banks around the world are basically flying blind right now because of this dynamic.
They are, and it's a really complex problem for them.
Unpack that a bit. Why are the central banks confused? Usually, their job is pretty straightforward. You know, if the economy's running too hot and prices go up, you raise interest rates. If it's stalling, you lower them. Why is AI scrambling their radar?
Because AI is shocking both the demand side and the supply side of the economy at the exact same time.
Okay, so on the demand side.
On the demand side, you have trillions of dollars being borrowed and spent on physical infrastructure right now. That massive spending drives up the cost of materials, labor, land. It's highly inflationary. So the central banks see this and think, well, we need to raise interest rates to cool this down.
But then there's the supply side of the equation.
Precisely. The entire promise of AI is that it will eventually create a massive boost to human productivity. It's supposed to automate tasks, streamline logistics, fundamentally lower the cost of doing business.
And that is deflationary.
Exactly. So the central banks are trapped. Do they raise rates to fight the inflation happening today? Or do they hold steady because AI might permanently lower costs tomorrow?
Man. And while the central banks try to solve that theoretical puzzle, there is a very real physical bottleneck threatening this entire debt-fueled dream.
The power grid.
Right. You cannot run a trillion-dollar digital brain without plugging it in. To power the AI revolution, you need an unfathomable amount of electricity.
The energy demands of modern data centers are exponential compared to traditional computing. They require continuous, uninterrupted power. And it's not just to run the processors.
It's the cooling, right?
Yes, you have to run these massive industrial cooling systems just to keep those processors from melting down.
Which perfectly transitions us into the new geoeconomics of energy. Because the trillions pouring into the tech sector are being matched dollar for dollar by the trillions pouring into the energy sector.
Absolutely.
Based on the 2026 IEA Energy Investment Report, global energy investments are hitting a historic $3.4 trillion in a single year. And the wildest part of that statistic, $2.2 trillion of it is going specifically into clean energy.
Which is nearly double the investment going into fossil fuels.
Right. So the Greek geopolitical analysis of this IEA report, it frames this shift perfectly. If you look at this through a historical lens, for the last century, the primary goal for any nation was securing cheap energy.
But today, that entire paradigm has shifted.
Entirely.
The primary goal is no longer just cheap energy. It is predictable and secure energy.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, though. When you hear about $2.2 trillion going into clean energy, the immediate assumption is, oh, the world has finally united to save the planet from climate change.
Right, the environmental narrative.
Yeah. But reading between the lines of this geopolitical analysis, this doesn't sound like environmentalism. It sounds like a geopolitical arms race.
Well, it absolutely is an arms race. The environmental benefits are almost viewed as a secondary byproduct by the major global powers right now.
Wow.
The real driver is strictly national security. The analysis points heavily to recent global conflicts, particularly the war involving Iran and the temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, that was a massive wake-up call.
Because that single event completely exposed the fatal vulnerability of global supply chains.
Because, what is it, something like 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply has to physically pass through that one tiny 21-mile-wide geographic choke point?
Exactly. And governments woke up to the reality that depending on distant, highly volatile geographical choke points is just an economic death sentence. You can't guarantee power to a multi-billion-dollar AI data center if your fuel supply can be cut off by a single naval blockade half a world away.
That makes total sense. So nations are investing in clean energy essentially to build domestic resilience against global shocks.
Yeah.
You know, this feels like a modern reboot of the 20th century oil monopolies. Back then, whoever controlled the oil fields controlled the global economy. Now it feels like if you control the battery tech, the solar panel manufacturing, the rare earth mineral processing, I mean, you are the new Standard Oil.
It's very much like Standard Oil, yes, but with a critical twist. What? John D. Rockefeller never had to worry about his oil fields suddenly becoming obsolete because another country learned how to harvest the sun better.
Oh, man, that is a great point.
The major global powers know this, but their strategies differ wildly based on their own unique vulnerabilities. Take China, for example. They are currently the world's largest importer of fossil fuels.
Which means they are the most vulnerable to those sea route disruptions we just talked about. If a conflict shuts down the shipping lanes, China's economy suffocates.
Therefore, for China, the green transition is a strict matter of national survival. They are pouring unprecedented capital into dominating the entire clean energy supply chain. Solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, and especially the processing of rare earth elements.
Right. So they aren't just trying to lower emissions. They are trying to monopolize the manufacturing of the new energy era so they can never be held hostage by foreign oil again.
Precisely. And then you look at the European Union, and their strategy is completely driven by trauma. The analysis makes it very clear that the EU is still reeling from their disastrous historical reliance on Russian natural gas.
Yeah, that really burned them.
So the EU's guiding philosophy now is what they call strategic autonomy. They're desperately trying to reindustrialize their continent using green technology.
But they have a dilemma there too, right?
Right. Their biggest fear is simply swapping out their old, crippling dependency on Russian gas for a brand new, equally crippling dependency on Chinese green technology. So they're trying to build this walled garden of European clean energy.
Meanwhile, the United States is just playing every single side of the board.
Pretty much.
The U.S. strategy is essentially total energy dominance. They are pouring hundreds of billions into clean energy and AI infrastructure, sure, but the government is simultaneously accelerating traditional fossil fuel extraction.
Yeah, they aren't choosing between green energy and black energy. They just want to own the global market for both.
And caught in the middle of these shifting tectonic plates, you have smaller, strategically vital nations like Greece.
Which is fascinating to watch.
Yeah, the analysis highlights how Greece is rapidly positioning itself as a major energy hub for the Mediterranean and Europe. They're aggressively building out liquefied natural gas terminals, cross-border electrical interconnections, and investing heavily in offshore wind.
So if you step back and look at the big picture, the very definition of global power has fundamentally changed. We aren't just talking about geopolitics anymore. This is geoeconomics.
Right, because in the 20th century, you measured a country's power by counting its tanks, its naval fleets, its underground oil reserves.
Today, power is measured by grid resilience. It's measured by artificial intelligence capabilities, semiconductor supply chains, and the ability to guarantee continuous, predictable power to your citizens and your servers, regardless of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz.
Predictability is really the ultimate luxury item of the 21st century.
It is.
But this is exactly where the grand multi-trillion-dollar spreadsheet collides with physical reality. Because while these superpowers are spending fortunes to build sterile, perfectly predictable, high-tech energy ecosystems, the physical environment that houses those ecosystems is currently violently unpredictable.
Vulnerable is putting it mildly. We just spent 20 minutes talking about global powers treating energy and tech as abstract numbers. But if you want to see what that vulnerability actually looks like right now, You just have to look at the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's brutal because while the spreadsheets project infinite growth, the physical reality in Greece right now is that people are fighting 125-kilometer-per-hour winds just to save their homes from burning to the ground.
The contrast is incredibly sobering. The infrastructure required for these massive digital leaps exists in a natural world that is becoming increasingly hostile.
Right. And to be clear to everyone listening, we are reporting on the facts of these ongoing events exactly as they are detailed in our real-time sources. We're looking at multiple severe wildfires ravaging Greek islands simultaneously.
We're seeing fires on Paros, Andros, Lesvos, Kalymnos, and perhaps most severely, Rhythmno on the island of Crete.
Let's talk about the physics of what is happening on the ground there, because it really underscores how fragile human engineering is. The Meteor Observatory in Athens reported winds of 10 to 11 on the Beaufort scale.
And for context, 10 to 11 on the Beaufort scale is classified as a violent storm verging on hurricane-force winds.
Yeah, they clocked gusts up to 125 kilometers per hour at Mario in Rhythmno. And at those wind speeds, the standard protocol of aerial firefighting just becomes physically impossible.
You can't fly in that.
No. It's not just that the planes and helicopters bounce around, it's that any water they drop is instantly vaporized or blown completely off target before it ever reaches the flames. The pilots are essentially grounded by the physics of the atmosphere.
Which leaves the entire burden of containment on the ground forces. And they are facing an almost incomprehensible scale of destruction. The dispatches from Rhythmno detail a single fire front stretching 15 to 20 kilometers long.
Yeah.
The situation escalated so rapidly that the Agios Vasileios municipality was forced to declare a state of emergency that will remain in effect for 3 months.
And the human toll behind these numbers is just devastating. Our sources confirm the deaths of 3 firefighters in the line of duty.
Awful.
In Rhythmno, a 25-year-old and a 58-year-old firefighter were tragically trapped in their vehicle after being completely disoriented by the thick, sudden influx of smoke.
And in a separate operation in Githio, a 27-year-old firefighter lost his life. The initial reports, translated from Greek, cited pathological causes.
Which, in English medical terms, essentially means a severe underlying health emergency, like a heart attack or cardiac arrest.
Right, brought on by the extreme physical stress and environmental toxicity of fighting a fire in those impossible conditions.
It is a profound tragedy, and it places the true human cost of this physical volatility front and center. The local authorities and emergency services are pushing their absolute limits to manage this crisis.
They are. The National 112 Emergency Text System has been firing off relentless evacuation orders, just trying to keep the civilian population one step ahead of a fire moving at unnatural speeds.
And the logistics of these evacuations are massive, especially on islands where geography limits your escape routes. There was this harrowing sea rescue at Preveli Beach.
I read about that.
The Coast Guard and a fleet of private boats had to coordinate to pull 51 people directly off the sand because the fire had cut off all land routes behind them.
Incredible. And in Aji Galini, which is a densely populated tourist area, authorities had to safely evacuate 2,000 tourists. They were moving them to stadiums and secondary hotels just to get them out of the smoke's path.
Which brings us back to the central theme of our deep dive today. How does this immediate, terrifying physical vulnerability complicate the grand geoeconomic plans we discussed earlier?
Well, it changes everything. Because that IEA energy report we analyzed heavily emphasized the need for resilience, and this is exactly why.
Because you can design the most advanced AI models in the world. You can map out a flawless, multi-trillion-dollar clean energy supply chain. But if a 125-kilometer-per-hour fire takes out the physical transmission lines, your digital utopia goes completely dark.
Exactly. The infrastructure driving this economic boom, the hyperscale data centers, the thousands of miles of power grids, the undersea fiber optic cables, the highly specialized semiconductor factories, they don't exist in the cloud.
Right, they exist in the dirt.
They exist in dirt, in water, and in forests. You can build a system with incredible digital predictability, but if the physical environment it relies on is completely unpredictable, the entire system is fundamentally fragile.
So why does all of this matter to you? When you look at your portfolio, or you look at the job market, or you just think about the device you're listening to this on right now, you have to understand that the collision of these two worlds is what will define your daily life for the next decade.
Without a doubt.
We have a trillion-dollar debt-fueled digital boom demanding infinite energy sitting right on top of an increasingly fragile, volatile physical climate that is struggling to maintain the grid we already have.
Central banks are trying to steer our economies through a storm of AI speculation. Superpowers are aggressively redrawing the map of global energy to secure their borders, and all the while, the physical world is throwing extreme destructive curveballs that test the absolute limits of human engineering and courage.
It really forces you to realize that no matter how advanced our digital progress gets, it is permanently, inextricably anchored to the ground.
It is, which leaves us with a final vital question to consider as these parallel trends accelerate.
Let's hear it.
If the AI revolution demands unprecedented exponential amounts of energy, and our climate is simultaneously testing the absolute physical limits of our power grids with extreme, uncontrollable events like the tragic fires in Greece. What happens when these two forces inevitably clash? Can our physical world actually sustain our digital ambitions?
That's the billion-dollar question. Think about that the next time you see an image of those perfectly clean, perfectly humming servers. Think about the wild, unpredictable world just outside their doors. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.